All right, welcome to our weekly current events and election 2020 update. I'm Akash.
And I'm Fatima.
And we're going to be talking a little bit this week about impeachment and then transitioning into our election 2020 update. As always, remember to follow Fileable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. So, like I said, we're going to talk a little bit about the impeachment inquiry and then tie in some concepts from AP Gov. We're going to talk about some other international current events, talk a little bit about the significance of Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and then transition into updates about the 2020 election. So let's get started. So last week we talked about how Nancy Pelosi, the Speaker of the House, would soon send the articles of impeachment over to the Senate. That did happen this week, and she appointed 7 impeachment managers to do that and be prosecutors in the trial. So the 7 impeachment managers were Adam Schiff of California. He was appointed the lead impeachment manager. Then there was Gerald Nadler of New York, Zoe Lofgren of California, Hakeem Jeffries of New York, Val Demings of Florida, Sylvia Garcia of Texas, and Jason Crow of Colorado. So all of these representatives are mostly in safe Democratic seats, and this represents a really diverse group. So this is definitely something that is a change from what there was with the Bill Clinton impeachment trial, in which most of the impeachment managers were white males. So definitely shows that there has been an increase in diversity in Congress. The impeachment articles were ceremoniously marched to the Senate chambers. It's pretty iconic. It was a precedent that was first set in Johnson's administration in 1868. And that's like the second picture that you can see below. And the impeachment managers, the 7 of them, are the prosecutors in the trial. So that's their role. And then we're gonna talk a little bit about what happened on Thursday with the trial. So the trial officially started last Thursday, and according to precedent and the Constitution, Chief Justice John Roberts presided over the trial. He was sworn in by the President pro tempore of the Senate, Chuck Grassley of Iowa, and he then administered the oath to all 100 senators. So the 100 senators are the ones that act as the jury during the trial. So we kind of talked about with AP Gov, the House is the one that impeaches, but the Senate is the one that acts as a jury, and they're the ones that actually conduct the trial. So that's something that's really important to know. If you look at the first picture on the top, that's John Roberts actually giving the oath to all the senators, and the picture on the bottom is him being given the oath. And you can read the oath right there. Do you solemnly swear that in all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of Donald Trump, President of the United States, now pending, you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws, so help you God. So the main things that's emphasized within this oath and within the trial that has now started is being impartial. So that's something that especially the liberal media has concentrated a lot on, saying that the Republican senators need to be impartial regardless of the party of the president. So that's kind of something that you'll see whichever party is, because the Republican Party has a majority in the Senate, and it's a Republican Party it's a Republican president that is being impeached. People of the Democratic Party may feel that the Republicans may not conduct the trial fairly, or they may not be impartial because it is a Republican president. So that's something that is really being emphasized. What happened on Thursday is really just considered pomp and circumstance. Really nothing of substance happened on Thursday towards the impeachment trial. The real thing won't start till tomorrow. So after Thursday, they went on recess for the Martin Luther King Day holiday, and then they're coming back tomorrow, and that's when the trial will actually start. So that's what we're going to talk about next. Mitch McConnell told the media that the opening arguments are expected to start tomorrow after the holiday break, like I said. It's the schedule for this impeachment trial is kind of to be determined, and we'll kind of see what happens as it goes on. More days may be needed to set the rules and procedures of the trial. That's kind of what the media is saying, especially with what happened with the Bill Clinton impeachment trial. It just depends how long. It depends on how long they get to set everything up and get started to when the actual thing will start. The schedule of the trial depends on whether the Senate calls witnesses to testify or if they vote as soon as they hear arguments. So that's also something that's yet to be determined. So we'll see as the trial goes on. Hopefully by next week, we'll have a better picture of when this will be over, and then we'll see if the president is acquitted or not. So the next thing we're going to talk about is a little bit of an AP Gov tie-in. So like I said before, you should know with impeachment that the House is the one that actually impeaches, but the Senate is the one that holds a trial on whether the president should be removed from office. However, the AP Gov syllabus actually emphasizes something a little bit different about impeachment. So not just knowing that aspect, but if you look at the second standard on here, it says impeachment, removal, and other legal actions taken against public officials deemed to have abused their power reflects the purpose of checks and balances. So checks and balances are like a major theme in the AP Gov course. Like if you don't get anything outside of the AP Gov course, make sure you know your checks and balances for the exam. This is something that's especially emphasized with Federalist paper number 51. Federalist 51 is one of your foundational documents that you'll be required to know for your AP exam, and could possibly be one of the ones you use on your for your response question where you have to write an argumentative essay. If you look at that paragraph below, it says the most practical method for keeping the government in check is to make sure that the government, or I can't see what it says underneath, but it's something to make sure that the politicians compete with each other in order to basically preserve the government. Checks and balances are a way where politicians can compete with each other. Impeachment is a major check on the executive branch by the legislative branch. Madison writes this in his Federalist paper 51. He says, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. So that's something that, even like a quote that you could pull out and use in your argumentative essay. So make sure you know that Federalist 51 is associated with checks and balances, and that impeachment is associated with checks and balances as well. And it's one of the biggest checks that the legislative branch has on the executive branch. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about Martin Luther King Day. In the past few years, a movement that's called Make It a Day On, Not a Day Off has kind of been started. This year is the 25th anniversary of the holiday being celebrated, and it celebrates the life and legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., a major civil rights activist. And it's the only national holiday that's designated as a day of service. So if you haven't done something today in your community, try and do something this week to commemorate Martin Luther King Jr. The picture at the bottom, I believe, is from a food drive in Alabama. Just doing something in your community, commemorating his life through service is something that's really being emphasized, not just this year, but every year in order to celebrate him. So next, we're going to talk about some international events. This is something that I saw Brandon did with his slides last week, and I thought that was super important because a lot of times we, being in the U.S., think that U.S. politics are the only things that matter to us, but international events can have a huge impact on what happens here in the United States, and they're very significant in world politics and in terms of our foreign policy and diplomacy. One thing that's happened over the past week is that protests in Lebanon have turned a lot more violent. There's been a lot of anti-government protests in the past few weeks, and it did turn more violent last week. Tear gas was used on protesters, so that was something significant that happened in the Middle East. Another thing from South America, the Secretary of Culture in Brazil was fired and removed from office after he quoted a Nazi leader in one of his videos. So that was something a little bit peculiar that happened, and he's obviously facing a lot of backlash, not only in his own country, but from leaders across the world. Then finally, protests picked up in New Delhi after a citizenship law was passed. So this law was actually passed back in December, but basically what it said was religious minorities from neighboring countries would be given a faster access to Indian citizenship, or a faster route to Indian citizenship, as long as they weren't Muslim. So obviously this is sparking a lot of protest from Indian Muslims, and that's something that has definitely picked up over the past week. So next, we're going to transition into the 2020 election update with Fatima.
Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is fundraising in 2020, because as you guys might know, the fact that Democrats and Republicans both have to raise like millions of dollars in order to run like competitive national elections now is something that is becoming more and more common. And so right now, the entirety of the Democratic field, so like all the Democrats that are currently running for the nomination, they've raised around 3 times more as much money as President Donald Trump. And so this is something that's like pretty unprecedented for like incumbents in like the 2000s, because first, President Barack Obama, his main GOP challengers, they barely outraised him in 2011. And President George Bush, he beat his top Democratic rivals fundraising in 2003. So the fact that Democrats are like raising so much more money is something that's like very surprising. And so the first way that we can like tie this into AP government is because of the incumbent advantage. So the incumbent advantage is pretty much the fact that people have more name recognition and they have more donor connections when they are an incumbent. And so if you're not familiar with what an incumbent is, it's the person that has like held the office before. So right now, President Trump is the incumbent candidate for the presidency, and all the Democrats and like there were few Republicans like trying to challenge his Republican nomination are the challengers. And so that's pretty much why it's very surprising. The fact that he hasn't raised more money than the Democrats, because like he already has this like national name recognition and he already has these donor connections, and it's way easier for him to like make the news because he is already holding office and like doing things that are like require national attention, right? And so the reasons why people think that this has happened is because it's like this combination of the fact that people like just dislike President Trump, and so they want to like replace him with any Democrat, and the fact that a lot of the Democrats, people like Senator Sanders and former Vice President Joe Biden, they have very like devoted followings, and people really want them to end up being the president. So those are the two main reasons why their Democrats have been able to raise more money than President Donald Trump in this recent presidential election. And so another reason why this is super important is because the senators that are currently in the Democratic field are going to be stuck in Washington because of the impeachment trial that's happening. So as Akhilesh mentioned earlier, even though the House is the one that like conducts the impeachment and like investigates and draws up the articles, the Senate is the one that actually like holds the trial, and the senators have to act as jury, so they have to like be there physically present during the trial, so they know everything that ends up happening, like all the arguments that are made by both the impeachment managers on the Democratic side and any of like the Republican defense. So they have to physically be there during the trial. And so the reason why that's super important is because the Iowa caucuses start in just a couple of weeks. So the candidates have to like be there physically like campaigning in order to like make sure that they're like getting there and like having access to most of the voters. And so 3 of the 5 best polling candidates right now, Senator Sanders, Senator Warren, and Senator Klobuchar, are going to be off the campaign trail because they're going to be in Washington, D.C. for the trial. And so they won't be able to like campaign as much as like Joe Biden, Pete Buttigieg, and Tom Steyer. And so that like obviously might seem like it's something that's very bad for them, right? Because they're not able to like have as much contact with people in Iowa, but they get a lot of national attention because of the impeachment trial. Obviously, impeachment has been like very big in the news, and so a lot of people have been discussing how the trial is going to go down, like what's going to happen. So the fact that all 3 of them like get to be there and we'll be hearing all the arguments firsthand means that like they could very likely just like go to like a news station or like network and decide to like give an interview after that night's proceedings are over. So it's not all bad, the fact that they have to be there. And so on that note, we're going to transition a little bit more into like policy. So Pennsylvania passed this new law that is intending to make voting more accessible in like a few different ways. The first is that it's making absentee ballots available to everyone. So before this law was passed, in order to get an absentee ballot, you had to like write in and like give some kind of reason as to why you couldn't physically make it to the polls. But now this new law lets like anyone who requests an absentee ballot get one. So you can just like mail your ballot in and you don't have to actually go to the polls on the day of the election. And so they also, the law is like making sure that people will like, or polling centers purchase new voting machines. And so the reason why this is very important is because a lot of the mail-in ballots, they're not actually going to be counted on the election night. And that's for a few different reasons, but one of them is because this new law mandates that all of the mail-in ballots be counted in like one central location in the county for like each different county. So that's going to delay the official vote count. And so one of the reasons why this is so important is because Pennsylvania is a very big swing state, or it is being considered one right now, right? Because President Trump only won the state by like a very small percentage. So how the state votes this time and where those electoral college votes end up going is very important to both Republicans and Democrats. So this has caused like a bit of tension because the Secretary of State for the state of Pennsylvania, who's been is in charge of like administering these elections, has said that it's going to be completely fine. Like as long as the county is like make sure they have extra staffing and they're like actually doing things in like a very efficient way, all of those votes can be counted on election night and they won't be late. But a lot of the different people who are actually like running the polling centers, like for example, Sarah May Silphy, who's the elections director for Monroe County, says that that's like completely impossible and that like there's going to be so many different things happening on election night and it's going to be very difficult for all those votes to be cast. And so this is obviously something that's like very interesting because it's not something that we talk about a lot, right? How these votes like end up being counted, especially like absentee ballots. So even though people can like predict who officially won the election, like even down ballot elections like state house or state senate, there won't be an official announcement until like a few days afterwards, potentially, which is something that can be very confusing for people to like understand. So that's what's going on in Pennsylvania. But another very interesting thing that's been happening is the fact that the Supreme Court is taking on a couple of different cases regarding the Electoral College. So you guys, especially for taking AP government right now, might know that like in the 2000s, in the early 2000s, Al Gore won the popular vote, but he lost the Electoral College. And so that's why Bush ended up winning the presidency, right? Because the Supreme Court ruled to favor the Electoral College in terms of determining the outcome of elections. And so this case doesn't have anything directly to do with that, or like it kind of does, but it's regarding the Electoral College. So the Supreme Court recently decided that it's going to take on a couple of different cases that decide whether or not Electoral College voters are allowed to like cast their ballots for people who didn't win the popular vote. And so, as you guys might remember, in 2016, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, but Donald Trump won the Electoral College, so he ended up winning the presidency. So it's happened a few different times in like history. And so that's part of the reason why these cases will be like potentially very consequential. And so these two cases are coming out of Washington State and Colorado. And so there were a few different electors who didn't vote for Hillary Clinton, despite the fact that she won the popular vote in both of those states. So the electors decided to vote for different candidates. And so in Washington State, there was the state law that said that if you like didn't vote for the person who won the popular vote, you could be fined $1,000. So 3 different electors from Washington State were fined that money. And so this idea of Electoral College voters like having faithfulness to the popular vote has in the past mostly been like a formality, right? And so like states passing these laws that like penalize electors in these small ways like hasn't been something that's been like this huge issue. There's never been like, oh, like 200 electors decided to vote for the person that didn't win the popular vote. Like in 2016, only 10 people did that out of 538. So how the Supreme Court decides this is going to be like, we'll find out in July. And so that's going to be well before the November election. And so it's very important that this is like happening way beforehand, because it means that it's not happening in the midst of like some kind of like huge crisis or anything. So it's happening in like a relatively calm time, like July. And so it's going to be very interesting to find out how the Supreme Court decides whether or not people should be or electors should be penalized for voting or not voting with the popular vote of their state, because like that's why we had the Electoral College, right? Like the whole idea was that the electors will make sure that no insane person gets like into presidential office. And so the last thing we're going to be talking about is Oklahoma's online voter registration. So just to set the scene a little bit, there's around like 30 states that currently have and allow online voter registration. And so it's been around 5 years since Oklahoma and its state legislature said that the Oklahoma Election Board could launch an online voter registration system. And so the reason why we're talking about this now, 5 years later, is that it still hasn't happened and it won't be ready for the November election. And so there's this woman named State Senator Julia Kurt, and she filed a bill that would require the election board to establish a secure online voter registration website by March 1st, 2021. And so it's very likely that this bill won't even make it out of like committee hearings. But the reason why she filed it is because she wants to create a sense of urgency that like this is something that's incredibly important and it's something that we need to get done, right? And so the reason why it hasn't been done as of like now, 5 years later, is because they're still waiting on the Oklahoma Department of Public Safety to like upgrade their computers to allow like the online voter registrations to be cross-referenced with like the people who are applying as driver's licenses or like state issued ID cards, because the state obviously has to comply with like this federal Real ID Act, which is attempting to make sure that people aren't like trying to register to vote when they're not allowed to. So that's it on that. Honestly, like we'll see what happens, but it's very likely going to not be finished by the end of 2020 and possibly not even by like early 2021, because this is like a very big overhaul of Oklahoma's like voter registration system.